Greetings. Why is it necessary for anyone to give a defence of Nietzsche? Well, of all of the philosophers that exist, Nietzsche is the one that most needs a defence. I've seen even just today on social media, someone claiming that Nietzsche never had a coherent thought and couldn't write a straightforward grammatical sentence. And his publisher, one of his publishers, Penguin Books, gave this as the cover and the title of his book. Thus spoke syphilis. That's an outrage. But okay, given all that, what is the problem? The deep problem here? Well, the problem refers really to trying to understand the last four works that Nietzsche wrote. These are Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and Nietzsche contra Wagner. Now those four works, in a sense, form a group. They articulate or move towards a more final position for Nietzsche. One of the odd things is that people generally don't read those works, so the last four works are often excluded from consideration. I suspect people who take Nietzsche very seriously don't read those works. They don't seem to. So, why? Well, everything goes back to this idea that has been very heavily traded upon, that Nietzsche died and that his last long convalescent illness for 11 years was due to syphilis. Why does that matter? Well, because that gives people a reason to not read those last works. The last works are unreadable. Why are they unreadable? Well, because he wrote them when he was dying from syphilis. That's been the idea. You don't read those last works because they're unreadable works. This then goes into and feeds this idea, well, you can be excused from not reading them because of this syphilis, etc., etc. Let's be clear. No one who looked at Nietzsche, who examined him, ever diagnosed him as having syphilis. His sister was in constant caring contact with him for a long time. There has never been any evidence of syphilis, and there would have been. Syphilis is a very scarring disease. So if he had syphilis, one would expect that it would be noticed and commented upon by a serious medical expert, particularly after he died. It wasn't done. It may have been supposed to be the case, but there is no evidence that it was the case. Nietzsche's collapse, in fact, everything about his illness doesn't really look like syphilis at all. What does it look like? Well, someone quite reasonably recently has suggested that it looks like maybe an aneurysm in the brain. Maybe that's true. Maybe it was what we would call a stroke. And the symptoms do look like those of a stroke. There doesn't seem to be any reason to think that Nietzsche had syphilis, and there's no reason to think that he had any sexual contact, in fact. This has all been supposed. And because it's been supposed, well, then we have the situation that we have. You can dismiss any part of Nietzsche that you like on the basis of, well, it's this creeping syphilis that he might have had. And you can pretend that it's all meaningless nonsense. He couldn't write, so the claim is. Couldn't think. It's all rubbish. Absolute nonsense. Nietzsche wrote beautifully, and he wrote, even when it's translated into English, it reads beautifully. It has such a flow and such an impact in the prose. It is astonishing writing. Most of the people who know and appreciate Nietzsche understand that and say it. This is philosophy writing, if you want to call it that exactly, because it's not normal philosophy writing, but it's philosophy writing of a kind. It's philosophy writing of a very high caliber, of an extraordinary caliber. There is no philosopher in history who is more enjoyable to read than Nietzsche. So, we are left in a sort of rather peculiar position. I'm having to defend Nietzsche against a vast number of people who want to dismiss him. And I want to say that many of the things that he said should be taken very seriously by philosophers, and that it was a mistake to dismiss them. Okay, so let's start off. The first thing I want to look at is, well, if it's in this video, I want to look at just simply some of the sections of the part of that first of those final four works, Twilight of the Idols. I want to look at the section called The Four Great Errors. And I want to look at, first of all, the first of them, which may seem something that is easily not taken in because it's rather bizarre. It is this. It's the idea that there was a particular figure in the 19th century who had a great effect on diet books. And he suggested that one way to a long life was to restrict one's calories, as we would say today, to restrict one's calories rather severely. His name was Cornaro. This is the era of confusing cause and consequence. And so this example from Cornaro is intended to make us understand what this confusion of cause and consequence might amount to. So it's rather important. Everyone knows the book of the celebrated Cornaro, in which he recommends his meagre diet as a recipe for a long and happy life. I do not doubt that hardly any book, the Bible rightly accepted, has done so much harm, has shortened so many lives as this curiosity, which was so well meant. The reason? Mistaking the consequence for the cause. The worthy Italian saw in his diet the cause of his long life, while the prerequisite of long life, an extraordinarily slow metabolism, a small consumption, was the cause of his meagre diet. He became ill when he ate more. But he who is not a carp is not for doing just the sufficient, but positively needs to eat properly. A scholar of our day, with his rapid consumption of nervous energy, would ruin himself with Cornaro's regimen, credo experto. So there you have the model, and here is the illustration of how this is meant to work here. My apologies for the tilting, but here's the idea. So Cornaro's idea is that calorie restriction causes his longevity. So the cause is the calorie restriction, and the longevity is the consequence. And what Nietzsche is claiming is that this cause to consequence, calorie restriction causes longevity, that this is a false causal connection, that it should rather be the other way around. So in this case, if you were to reverse that, what you would say is longevity is the cause of the calorie restriction. That would be the reversing cause and consequence. Longevity is the cause of the calorie restriction. But that doesn't sound quite right. It's absurd to try to reverse this and claim that longevity causes the calorie restriction, because the longevity is the thing that comes afterwards. That would be a strange way to have this. You could perhaps say that the longevity or the potential for longevity causes the causes calorie restriction, but even that doesn't seem quite right. So what's Nietzsche's argument, or what's Nietzsche's solution here? What does he say? Well, it looks more like this. Nietzsche's view looks more like there is such a thing as a slow metabolism. That slow metabolism causes calorie restriction, and this slow metabolism also causes longevity. That's Nietzsche's preferred way of putting it. Now, the point is, that isn't quite the reversal of this. That's not saying that longevity is causing calorie restriction. That's saying that two effects, two consequences, longevity and calorie restriction, are being caused by one thing, namely slow metabolism. Now, that's Nietzsche's claim, but I'm not so sure that that's right either. What we know, I think, now clearly, is that calorie restriction causes your metabolism to slow down. So this calorie restriction is really the cause of slow metabolism. If you increase your calories to a normal amount, then your metabolism rises to the point which it should be. And I don't think it's by any means agreed that a slow metabolism causes longevity. I'm not an expert in this, but I've certainly not heard this claim that slow metabolism causes longevity. So this is Nietzsche's view, but it doesn't seem any more correct than Cornaro's view. Instead, it seems like calorie restriction, which should be back here, causes slow metabolism, and then this very dubious claim that this slow metabolism causes longevity. So this is set up as Nietzsche's model for what he wants to say, and his analysis of Cornaro is based on his claim about this is a reversal. I don't see how it's a reversal, because here's the main point. Cause precedes consequence. The cause comes first, and it's followed by the consequence. Now that gives you an order in time. The cause is temporally precedes the consequence. And that's more or less agreed to, because if you have the consequence coming before the cause, that is known as backwards causation, which is meant to be ruled out. Some people want to rule it in, but for the most part, it's ruled out. So saying that the consequence can be the cause, as it were, come before the cause, that is a highly dubious claim. And it's not, I think, the right analysis of what Nietzsche wants to claim in this case, which is this. And I think it's highly doubtful. So I don't think Cornaro really understood why he had longevity, if he even did. At what point did he declare that he had longevity? This is, I think, a very unclear point, and for the most part, I think it's more likely that longevity was something in his genes, that he was genetically predisposed to live a long life, probably from having ancestors who lived a long life. That's more likely than the idea that his longevity was caused by calorie restriction ultimately. That's a highly dubious claim. I think calorie restriction is more likely to shorten one's life, because not only will it slow one's metabolism, but if one is calorie restricting with the wrong foods, one will be nutritionally deficient. And that seems the most likely thing. So I don't think this idea of this is a model for what Nietzsche wants, which is that what we suppose to be the effects or the consequences can precede the cause. I don't think this works at all. Okay. And this is absolutely crucial. Here is the important application that Nietzsche wants to make of this Cornaro idea, that the Cornaro is getting the order of the causation, the cause and the consequence, round the wrong way. What does Nietzsche want to say about that? Well, he wants to apply it to morality in general. This is so important that I want to read the entire passage out to you. And I'll put it on the screen as well. The most general formula at the basis of every religion and morality is, do this and this, refrain from this and this. and you will be happy. Otherwise, the obvious threat comes next. Every morality, every religion is this imperative. I call it the great original sin of reason, immortal unreason. In any mouth, this formula is converted into its reverse. Sorry, in my mouth, this formula is converted into its reverse. First example of my revaluation of all values. Now that's one of the important things. His last book was meant to be a book called Revaluation of All Values. What was meant to be in it? Well, it wasn't meant to be the will to power. It was meant to be, at least in this first example that we have here, exactly what we're getting in this passage. So it's important to pay attention to it. First example of my revaluation of all values. A well-constituted human being, a happy one, must perform certain actions and instinctively shrinks from other actions. He transports the order of which he is the physiological representative into his relations with other human beings and with things. In a formula, his virtue is the consequence of his happiness. Long life, a plentiful posterity, is not the reward of virtue. Virtue itself is rather just that slowing down of the metabolism, which also has, among other things, a long life, a plentiful posterity, in short, Cornarism as its outcome. The church and morality says, a race, a people perishes through vice and luxury. My restored reason says, when a people is perishing, degenerating physiologically, vice and luxury, that is to say, the necessity for stronger and more frequent stimulants, such as every exhausted nature is acquainted with, follow therefrom. A young man grows prematurely pale and faded. His friends say, this and that illness is to blame. I say, that he became ill, that he failed to resist the illness, was already the consequence of an impoverished life and hereditary exhaustion. The newspaper reader says, this party will ruin itself if it makes errors like this. My higher politics says, a party which makes errors like this is already finished. It is no longer secure in its instincts. Every error of whatever kind is a consequence of degeneration of instinct. Disgregation, which means sort of evaporation, if you like, sort of dispersal, disgregation of will, one has thereby virtually defined the bad. Everything good is instinct and consequently easy, necessary, free. Effort is an objection. The god is typically distinguished from the hero. In my language, light feet are the first attribute of divinity. Now, if one is inclined to skate over the whole Cornaro thing at the beginning, which may seem irrelevant, if one skates over that, one won't understand this idea, because this is now central to Nietzsche's last ideas on morality, on what it means to be moral. And it's not a nihilism. His view here is not that, one needn't ever think of doing the right thing. The idea is that one does the right thing because one is, as follows on from the Cornaro idea, one is well nourished, one is well constituted. The well constitutedness gives rise to what one could call a correct moral behavior. Now, because he says it in this way, one is inclined to mistake exactly what it's saying, because Again, the problem is his model of reversing cause and effect. Let's go through it again. So again, let's take note. We have cause to consequence, and the original view, the one he is disagreeing with, the conventional view, is that virtue is the cause, virtuous behavior prescribed by religions and their moral dictates. Virtue causes happiness. Cause to consequence again. Virtue causes happiness. Now, when Nietzsche reverses this, Nietzsche's view is, well, that view is wrong. Instead, what we should understand is that happiness causes virtue, which is what he says. But that sounds completely bizarre. It's not happiness that causes virtue. When he explains what he means by happiness, it turns out that it's the well-constitutedness of the individual, the fact that the individual is a strong, healthy individual that leads that individual to exhibit virtues. Now, these can't be the same virtues as the Christian moralist, because that's the kind of thing he rejects. So when he says virtue here, it's very When he says virtue here, it's very unclear what he means by that. But what I think he means is his own idea of virtue, the sort of things that are strong. This is a circular point. The sort of thing that a strong individual might be doing. We don't know what that is, but it certainly can't be the original virtue that we had here, which is religious virtue that is prescribed in a certain culture, and certainly not every culture, that is supposed to lead to a happiness which is different in every religion. So this can't be reversed. What he's going for is something like a rough kind of reversal, very imprecise, in which happiness, or the well-constitutedness of the individual, gives rise to a particular kind of virtue, which is particular to that well-constituted individual. So it might be, caring for one's parents in their old age, or it might be looking after one's children to the best that one can, to the best of one's ability. Or it might be something else. It might be something that is not prescribed by religions, or indeed, it may be something, like one should revenge the wrongs that are done to one's family, or something of that kind. It's unclear what it should be, but it can't be exactly the reverse of this first version. He's misdescribing it in a particularly interesting and awkward way, which I think has led to it not being understood. But it has to be understood if we're to understand Nietzsche, because he wants, very particularly, this arrow of causation, cause to consequence. This is the first part of his revaluation of all values. Now, what I want to say about this is that this idea ties in with a lot of other things that Nietzsche says that also appear irrelevant to many readers. For example, in Ecce Homo, he speaks about nutrition and goes on about his own nutritional problems, about how it took him a long time to understand the significance of having good nutrition. And he praises the nutrition of the Piedmont area, and against the German, for example, nutrition, which he takes to be terrible. And the point is, his idea of well-constitutedness is tied into his idea about what bodies really need. They need good nutrition, and the good nutrition over a long period gives rise to this well-constituted human being. And he says clearly, for a long time, he didn't understand that himself. So for a long time, what you seem to get is a kind of nihilism, but what that really is an anti-Christian idea of virtue. He certainly does hold that. Holds it here and held it before. But he's not completely a moral nihilist. He believes that morality comes about naturally as a result of being well constituted, and that means of being well fed, well nourished, and of having the conditions for a good life. These are the important things for him. So that is where we end up. And ecce homo, though it looks to be silly sometimes to many readers, actually has a lot of information in it about exactly what he means by this. Nutrition becomes one of the most important things for him. And I have to say, that seems to be a very good position to have, because it seems true to me at least, I must say, that good nutrition is maybe one of the most important things we don't pay attention to. And we philosophers, are the worst offenders at this. And that's what he's really pointing out, that philosophers from Descartes onwards were getting this all wrong. Descartes split us into two things, the mind and the body. And they were they were regarded as sort of separate from one another, except that they were in some kind of form of interaction with one another, but they were two different realms. That's what he's against. And he's against this, he's for the body, which no philosopher after Descartes said anything really about. No philosopher said what Nietzsche is saying, that virtue stems from the strength of the body, from the well-constitutedness of the body, for the nutritional aspects of being well-fed and of being content in oneself. He has understood that that's what's important. That's extraordinary, but that's his final view. So, where does that take us in the next section then? Now we can put in perspective what he says subsequent to this. His idea is that, and I have mentioned this before in this video, which is rather should be considered as an accompaniment to this one, I've said that Nietzsche regards all of our internal ideas as the idea of motives, of the idea of will, of the idea of I, the self, the ego, which is a misleading word here, the I is projected in some sense on ourselves. We take these things to be faculties within ourselves that are the causes of our actions. But all of this is, he says, a nonsense. We're just simply inventing these things and thinking that this is how we are actually working. Now, what I want to say about this is that this is a profound idea, and it has given rise to a huge movement in 20th century philosophy, which disparages what is called folk psychology. Now, folk psychology is all of this talk of motives and desires and beliefs as things that are genuinely could be found in the brain. But as physiologists or neuroanatomists have been looking at the brain for years, they haven't found such things. They found rough areas where certain kinds of processing takes place. But there's no obvious place for a desire or a belief, so this claim goes, and all of these other aspects of folk psychology. All of this was called into question in the late 70s, was very, very popular in the 80s and 90s. This idea that folk psychology is a kind of a mythology which we have imposed upon ourselves, and that it's best to be gotten rid of. We would do ourselves a favor, if you like, if we didn't have this kind of thing bogging us down. We could investigate brains and behavior much more easily if we didn't try to fit in these mythical entities, these ghost-like entities, like belief and desire and motive and will and all those other things. That idea of folk psychology being something which is just a set of mythological entities that we should get rid of was the view of Paul and Patricia Churchland. I'll give you these titles here: Paul and Patricia Churchland, and also Stephen Stitch, and a number of others, including Daniel Dennett, who's passed away just recently. This idea of folk psychology is a burdensome psychology that we would be best to go around, as it were, to avoid, if we're trying to genuinely explain behavior and how the brain gives rise to behavior from its various inputs. That idea has become a very popular notion in modern cognitive psychology, well, at least as practiced by philosophers. The problem is, this idea comes from Nietzsche, and not one single person that I have read, which goes up to a certain point in the late 90s, maybe later it does occur, not one single person that I have read credits Nietzsche with this view. No one. You can look back and look into the bibliographies. No one credits Nietzsche. And yet, Nietzsche, as far as I can tell, was the first to say this. And people don't credit Nietzsche, I suspect, because, again, there is that view. Nothing Nietzsche said in his last works was significant. You can dismiss it all. You don't have to worry about it, because the poor man was degenerating from this syphilis infection that no one actually ever identified. It's scandalous, really. Quite scandalous, and Nietzsche would have been better served, he would have been understood better and incorporated more into mainstream thought if people had bothered to read his last 4 works, because they contain his last philosophy, and they contain so much that is interesting and profound. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, it's at least worth discussing. And that is, I think, true for a lot of Twilight of the Idols. That's been my main contention here. The Twilight of the Idols contains a great deal that we should care about. No matter what your philosophical view is, it's worth caring about. And by the way, I should say this also. It's simply unbelievably false to say that Nietzsche's final works are incoherent or that they show the signs of degeneration. Nothing of the kind is true. The Antichrist, for example, is many pages, not just a little shy of 100 pages, of incredibly coherent philosophy. You may not like it. No, many people will not. I'm not denying that. Many people will dislike it. But you can't deny that it's a sustained attack. It's not aphorisms. It's not a lot of little short bits that have been sort of put together. This is a sustained argument, and it's worthwhile taking it seriously. You certainly can't dismiss it as incoherent nonsense, because it's not. It's quite coherent. Same is true of Twilight of the Idols, even though it sort of contains a lot of things in its very short space. Many of those things are very coherent and straightforwardly interesting, particularly for philosophers who are interested in the metaphysics that Nietzsche had. Nietzsche's point, then, about folk psychology not being useful has become a very important idea. What is Nietzsche's view here altogether? Well, it falls all of it falls under the heading of a kind of naturalism. That's also a very common and popular view today among philosophers. And they should have credited Nietzsche with this a long time ago. Naturalism is the idea that if you want to understand human beings, abstract concepts like the categories of Aristotle or logic as Aristotle gave it, or the ideas or the forms as Plato gave it, all of this is the wrong way to approach it. Naturalism is the idea is you look at how creatures evolved. Where did they come from? And how did they evolve in time? Well, then you would have to trace us back to some kind of Paleolithic origin and look at where we came from and how we evolved in that. And that's exactly, I think, where Nietzsche is going with his idea that well-constitutedness and proper nutrition, the proper human diet, which we didn't have in Nietzsche's time, as he was well aware, and we don't really have today any more than we had then, probably considerably less. That this is an important thing to understand what we are, who we are, and what we should do. What is our nature? If we want to understand that, we have to understand our past. It's no good thinking of us as beings that magically appeared. We didn't. We came from somewhere. We evolved in a particular way, and the particular way we evolved shapes how we behave in groups, why we behave a certain way in groups, and how we come to behave badly in a way which is against our people, our group, whatever you want to call them, our species, if you like. All of that is a naturalistic perspective. How do we know the things that we know? Well, we have to understand that to some extent naturalistically through our senses. Empiricism was a step in that direction of being a naturalist about how we come to know what we know. What should we believe in? Why should we believe in these things? Did these beliefs come about not because we have good reason to believe in them, but because we're constituted in such a way that we're predisposed, maybe to even believe false things? Maybe that's the case. And that is what Nietzsche is getting at when he denigrates this idea of the will. It's a chimera for him. It's not something that exists. It's something that we came to believe in. The self is something that we came to believe in for him, I'm saying. All of these things are things which have arisen in us as beliefs, which don't actually have any foothold in reality. That's his idea. That is way ahead of its time. All of these ideas are things which now modern philosophers are paying a lot of attention to. And not one of them, again, is paying any tribute to Nietzsche in doing so, though these ideas come from him. Whether it's said or not, they come from Nietzsche. No one said these things before Nietzsche. So Nietzsche needs defending, and he needs clarifying, and by God, it needs to be said that there is much more in Nietzsche that is worthy of attention than is usually said. I think I've got that off my chest now. Thank you.